Hello, teachers. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Janine Matz. I am an English language specialist with RELO. I would love to see where you are joining us from. So please comment in the chat. Tell us where you are joining us from. Are you in Peru, in Ecuador, in Chile, in Egypt? I know usually we have people from all over the world. So this is a wonderful experience to get to know each other, even if it's virtually, through a shared love, which is teaching English. So let's get started with today's topic. As you can see, today's topic is teaching and testing through competences. This is a very popular topic lately in the region, not only in Peru, but also in Ecuador and in other countries in the region. So hopefully you will find this session very useful in your daily practice. Okay, so let's see. First, we need to determine what competences are. What are we talking about when we're talking about competences? Hello to those of you who are just joining us. Hello from Peru. Hello, Santi. Thank you for always being here. Hello, Eliberto in Venezuela. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so what are competences? Let's see. We can say that competences in the English curriculum refer to the integrated and purposeful ability to use knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values to understand, communicate, and interact effectively in English across different real-life contexts. They emphasize not only mastering the language, grammar, and vocabulary, but also the capacity to use English meaningfully to achieve communicative goals, whether listening, speaking, reading, or writing. Wow. That's a long definition, right? But if we look at that definition, we realize that none of this is talking about teaching grammar rules, right? None of this is talking about conjugating verbs or forming second conditionals per se. Yeah, we're talking about using language in context, about using language to communicate, right? That is at the root of competences. If we want to, as teachers, if we want to be successful in teaching through competences, we first need to permanently change our mindset from traditional to more current approaches to foreign language teaching. My question to you is, what does that entail? What does that mean? What does it mean that to permanently change our mindset from traditional to current approaches? Eliberto tells us it's a complex process. Yes, I agree. In a lot of classrooms across Latin America, it represents a big change. And change is difficult for humans, right? But this is a change that we know we need to make as language teachers. And why do we need to make this change? Why do we need to change from traditional to current approaches? We have one main, big, huge reason. And that is because science, research, investigation tells us that traditional methods of language teaching do not work. They do not work. In what sense? They don't work to help students to actually use the language to communicate. That is the problem. right? If we teach using traditional methods, our result are students who can memorize all of the irregular participles in alphabetical order, but they can't use those participles to communicate in English. And again, as I've done in previous webinars, I invite you teachers to think about, what is your goal in your English classes? What do you want for your students? Truly, really, in your heart, what do you want for your students? Do you want them to conjugate each verb correctly and perfectly and have them in alphabetical order? Or do you want your students to tell you that they used English to communicate with tourists, for example? Yeah. Most of us want our students to use English. So if we want them to use English in real life, then we need to teach them English in a way that allows them to use the language in real life, right? Like Heriberto says, to communicate effectively. Yes. And what is communication? Exchanging ideas and all those things. We don't exchange ideas by memorizing irregular participles in alphabetical order, right? If I asked Spanish speakers to do the same thing in Spanish, in your native language, los participios irregulares en orden alfabético in Spanish, I think that's quite difficult, right? It's quite difficult because that's not how our brain works with language. So if that's the case, we need to convince ourselves first as teachers and say, yes, I really, truly believe that we need to change the way we are teaching if we want different results in the classroom, right? If we don't convince ourselves of that first in our minds and in our hearts, how can we convince our students to work with us in that way? It's difficult. It's very difficult to get our students to work with us if we are not convinced that this is better for them. Okay, so that's step one. Also, to be able to teach through competences, there are some general guidelines. So first, language must be seen as a natural human faculty that is acquired through exposure to comprehensible input. On this same RELO Andy's Facebook page, you have webinars, previous webinars that talk more about language acquisition and comprehensible input. So you can review those webinars from last year. In May, I believe there is a webinar from May of 2024 about comprehensible input. So if you want to learn more about that, you can review the previous webinar, okay? Mechanical drills and meaningless repetition should not be used as our main teaching techniques. Mechanical drills are what? Do you know what mechanical drills are? Maybe some of you continue to use those in your classrooms because they're very typical. Very typical. Conjugate the verb in parentheses in the present perfect continuous form. I blank study Spanish for 10 years. I have been studying. Yeah. These exercises, although they seem very organized, are not effective for language acquisition. They don't work for communication. Yeah. Our students can complete these exercises, get a grade of 10 over 10, and not understand anything that they just wrote at all. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, we need to make sure that the students are processing the language, the meaning of the language, right? These activities should be replaced with a communicative approach to language teaching. Okay, my question for you is, teachers, we use this term so much, a communicative approach, a communicative approach. What is communicative language teaching for you? Please respond in the chat. Would you like to share with us your vision, not a dictionary vision, your vision of communicative language teaching? What does that mean? What is communicative language teaching for you in your reality? Yeah, you can respond in the chat and we'll take a look at your answers. And another important component to be able to teach through competences is your English proficiency as teachers. Your English language proficiency is crucial, absolutely crucial. It means that you as teachers, as English teachers, should always continuously strive to improve your own English. Why? Because if we want to teach through competences, which means naturally teaching communicatively, you need to have an English that is also communicative, right? Yes. So be sure to also continue to consistently improve your English. We all can. I'm a native speaker of English and I can improve my English. In what way? My vocabulary. If I read more, I can increase my vocabulary in my native language, right? I've been speaking Spanish for 30 years now, essentially, but I still can improve in Spanish. How? By exposing myself to more Spanish, documentaries, books, etc., right? So even those of you right now watching who may have a C1 level, that's awesome. That's wonderful. You can still continue to improve your English, your fluency, your vocabulary, etc. Okay, so I encourage you to make it a continuous process for you as well. Do not study grammar rules anymore because you know all the grammar rules. You teach those, right? Just live in English as much as possible. And that will help naturally to improve your own proficiency in the language. Okay, thank you. All right, let's take a look at the general competences. So what are we talking about? Yes, thank you, Yolanda. I'm reading some of the comments in your chat. Using language meaningfully and purposefully through real life situations. That is communicative language teaching. Yes, thank you for that. Eliberto also mentions us to develop the communicative competence, not only linguistic, not only grammar and vocabulary, but also pragmatic competence and things like that. Good, exactly. Okay, so what are competences in general? If we look at the Peruvian curriculum, if we look at the Ecuadorian curriculum and other curriculums in the region, we can see some commonalities among the curricula, okay? One of those is what the general competences are. And here, what we're talking about is essentially what we knew before as being the 4 skills, right? The 4 skills, the traditional 4 skills. Yeah, we're not talking about soft skills or anything. We're talking about the traditional 4 skills, right? Before, these were divided into passive and active skills, okay? But now we use different terminology. We call them receptive and productive skills. Because even the skills of listening and reading, even though it seems passive, right? Because we're not producing the language, we have to be active listeners and active readers to receive and process the language, right? So now we call these the receptive skills. And the active skills, that we don't call them active, we call them productive, are the ones where we produce the language, so speaking and writing. Okay, so those are the general competences. Within these competences, we also have some that could be called embedded, right? Like, for example, critical thinking, interaction, reflection, reasoning, creative thinking, autonomy, etc. Okay, these are, we can call them maybe sub-skills, and we can also develop these at the same time that we are developing the general competences. Okay, they don't need to be separate. No, it's possible to develop these at the same time that we do the general competences. Okay, I'm going to give you first some general practical tips about working with the competences. And then we're going to look at each one specifically and some specific examples for each one. Okay? As I'm explaining this, please feel free to share in the chat any experiences that you have had teaching through competences. Have you created your own activities? What activity has been very successful for you? Thank you, Eliberto, for your comment. What activity has been very successful for you? What has worked really well in the classroom? Please share with us, because if we can share together, we can improve together. Okay, so please share in the chat. Okay, so some general practical tips for teaching with competences. Use authentic, meaningful tasks. For example, debates, interviews, blogs. Okay, this works for high school level, right? teenagers, for example. For younger children, we won't do a debate or a blog, right? But with children, we can do small role plays, we can do songs. They love songs, they love music. Even adults love music, right? We can use music, we can use things that are appropriate for their age. Yes. Integrate the 4 skills around real world themes. Do you remember maybe when you were English students and when I was a Spanish student, we always saw these activities, right? Where they had sentences. In the case of Spanish, it was always Juan, Maria, Pedro. Like those were the typical names we used in our Spanish activities. But in English, John, Jill, whatever. Do you remember those activities where you had to fill in blanks and the sentences were all separate from each other? They had no context. They would say, my brother is, and you're like, who's your brother? Who are we talking about, right? Before, these activities were void of context. They had no context. The sentences didn't go together in a real world theme. Now we are working always within a context because language is used in a context. It's used in a context. We communicate in a context, right? So if we want our students to communicate, we need to provide a real life context for that communication, okay? So we always think of that first. Encourage collaborative projects and spontaneous role playing. And here I can see how Eliberto also mentioned role playing in the chat. And I add the word spontaneous here. Why is that crucial? Because what happens when we do role plays? Many times teachers say, okay, write a dialogue of 10 lines per participant using this form, using this vocabulary, go. Yeah. And the students write the dialogue. And then the teacher says, tomorrow in class, you come to class and you perform your dialogue in front of the class. So what happens? Okay, the student goes home and they memorize, right? They memorize. Okay, I need to memorize this. Yes. Okay, I got it. Okay, I go to class the next day. I'm not speaking, yeah, like real life. I'm reciting words that I memorized in English. That is not real speaking, right? And what happens is that sometimes when students perform a dialogue that they have memorized, their memory fails them. So it's not necessarily that they can't express themselves in English, but their memory is not working and they forget their lines. You see? So it's very important that we make vomiting sentences. Yes, Eliberto, that's an interesting way of saying it. It's very important that we make our dialogues as real as possible, okay? And as like less scripted and more spontaneous. It's very important. Use formative assessment to monitor progress on competencies. What is formative assessment? Formative assessment is when we measure a particular, in this case, competence, and how far our students have advanced from the beginning of when we're working with this competence, right? So we want to see what they have gained in the period of time that we have been working on this competence. So we can use formative assessment to monitor their progress in that case. Okay, Maria asks a question in the chat. What is your recommendation for teaching verbs? Okay, this is a good question because I anticipated that teachers were going to say, okay, I can work on reading, I can work on writing, but I need to teach them present perfect. How do I do that through the competences? So thank you for your question, Maria. I'm going to address that in a moment, okay? Look, you read my mind, Maria. This is exactly what I anticipated would be the questions that teachers would have. How do I teach grammar and vocabulary this way? I understand teaching listening, working on reading, working on writing, but if I need to teach new grammar, right? How do I do that? How do I teach new grammar in this format? We can do it through the competencies, yeah? Not the old-fashioned way, but through the competences, and I'm going to show you how to do that, okay? In general, What we need to do if we're teaching new grammar or new vocabulary using the competences is exactly what I just see in the chat from Eliberto. Man, next time we can do a team webinar, Eliberto. That's awesome. Yes, we need to do it inductively, which means first we provide input with the target structure through listening and reading. There are the competences, right? I'm going to focus on listening and reading when it's a new structure for my students. That needs to be my first focus because it's input. It's what the language the students receive, right? Then, and only then, after they have received abundant quantities of comprehensible input through listening and reading, then we can have the students produce output, produce the structure through speaking and writing. We can do this well using the competences by using CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning. This is an approach that we can use to teach English through other subjects, through math, through science, through social studies, through the arts, etc. I will show you an example. And or other communicative approaches. Look, other communicative approaches. Wait, I thought communicative approach is singular. But no. Today, we're noticing that, in fact, there are many approaches to language teaching that are by nature communicative because they focus on communication. They focus on the exchange of messages, of understanding meaning, things like that, right? So task-based learning, for example, project-based learning, which are very popular nowadays. Yes, even gamification, as we use more as a technique, right? That can also be communicative. So we have many options with how we can design our classes according to different approaches, but they all can involve the competences. Yeah, and we just need to remember that for every activity, we need a real life context. Yes, TPR is definitely another example. Thank you. Okay, I have another question for you. Please share with us in the chat. Have you teachers ever created your own listening or reading activities? Tell us about them. Yes, you have texts. I'm sure some of you work with texts or worksheets or a collection of something. Yeah, but tell us about your own activities that maybe you have created. Maybe it's with the help of AI, artificial intelligence. That's okay. We can use it to help us with ideas for activities. So please share that in the chat. If you have ever worked with your own listening or reading activities, what has been your experience? Okay. Okay, here are some examples. I took each one of the competences and I broke it down into some ideas of what we can do and some tips that we need to remember. Okay, so for example, comprehending oral text activity. In other words, listening. Because oral text is what we hear. And I did this for approximately an A2 level of English because I know the reality is, even though in the region, in the curricula, we strive for B1, in reality, our students are lucky if they reach A2 because there are not many hours of English during the week, etc., right? So I did this for an A2 level. So for example, if we want to work with the competence of listening, we can listen to a short conversation in a restaurant, for example. We can find one online. We can create the conversation ourselves. We can record it in our voices with another colleague, whatever you want, right? And we can have students answer true-false questions based on what they heard. Yeah, they think about, okay, they reflect on the dialogue and then they respond to the questions. Before we do any activity, though, we need to make sure that we do a pre-listening activity where the students are prepared for the context, right? So we can talk to them. What is your favorite restaurant? What is your favorite, do you go with your family? Simple questions so that it activates what we call the schemata and they have an idea of the context of the activity, okay? Be sure to include target vocabulary, in this case, for example, food items, or grammar. In this case, I can imagine imperatives, for example. Yeah, it depends on what you are working with. But we should include that also in the listening. so that students get exposed to the new grammar and the new vocabulary. And here's the trick: in context, right? In context. That's very important. Okay. It's ethical, it's okay. We can use ChatGPT or other AI platforms to help you create content. Give me an idea of a dialogue between, these people and this level of English, things like that, and it will help you. AI is not perfect. You need to review it. You need to make changes. You need to adjust it to your reality. But we can use it to gather ideas, okay? Okay, I have a question here for you. It's your opinion, your thought. Should we provide students with the written script when we work with the competence of listening, comprehending oral texts? Should we give the students the written script, the text? Should they look at it? What do you think? Do you think it's a good idea or not a good idea for them to look at the script? So I can see here, Eliberto shared with us his opinion, the written script at the end after doing the activity for checking comprehension. Okay, I think that is a valid answer, Eliberto. If we are trying to isolate the competence of listening, if we want to be sure that our students are able to perceive and understand spoken English, then I think that's a valid point, right? But I can also see an argument for the other side. Yeah. There's also an argument for the other side, and it's this. If I am introducing new grammar to my students, for example, it is the first time that my students will see the present perfect. Just listening to the present perfect is difficult to pick up because it's a new form for them, right? So in that case, it might be convenient if I'm really working on teaching them the present perfect. That's my focus. Like I really want them to get this form. Yes, I'm working with listening, but it's convenient for students, at least at the beginning, to have both oral and written input. So in that case, I could see an argument in favor of giving the students the script, because then they can see the verb forms there, right? They can see the new forms. And furthermore, it's also a good idea, if I'm teaching a new grammar structure, to highlight the structure, yeah? Or to put it in a different color, or to put it in capital letters or in bold print or something where the students can really focus their attention on that structure, what I want them to learn, so that I know that they are focusing on the new structure that they're seeing. Yes, this is part of what we call processing instruction. It's how we help our learners to really absorb the new form that I want them to learn. But notice, it's all in a context, right? It's not just random verbs conjugated with random subjects in random sentences. No, we create a context. That's why when we do these activities, the first thing we need to ask ourselves, if we're teaching grammar through competences, is say, what real life context uses this grammar form? So if I'm going to teach imperatives, right? I say, okay, imperatives, yes. In real life, what do I use imperatives for? Okay, I use imperatives to give orders, yes. And where do I give orders? Or who gives orders, right? Okay, I can think of a situation of a parent, a mother or father, to the child. That's somewhere where we would see orders, right? I can also see a recipe. A recipe has commands, yes? Or giving directions to somewhere. That also has command forms. All of these things, this helps us to contextualize the language. I take the form and I say, what real life context do I use this form in? Once I have my context, then I can build my activity based on competences. Yeah? Okay. We have more comments here in the chat. Thank you. Santi says there is something we need to do to prepare our material according to students' needs, their environment, and their real context. Yes, yes. And this also means simplifying the language. Absolutely, absolutely. Because In the national curriculum in the countries in the region, it looks wonderful on paper. The curricula are wonderful documents, except we know that because of different circumstances, maybe what the curricula says is not the exact reality in our classroom. Okay, but that does not mean that we should teach traditionally. No, because the curricula does not allow for teaching traditionally in any country in the region. We all are teaching communicatively. In Argentina, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Uruguay, in Paraguay, in Ecuador, in Peru. Every one of those countries are teaching communicatively, not traditionally. And just because we don't have the time or something does not mean we can teach mechanically, because we're really not helping the students that way, right? So we really need to continue teaching communicatively, but like Santi says, adjust it to their reality, to their level, to their reality. Okay. Yolanda says it's helpful to have students familiarize and analyze sentence structures in context. Sure, absolutely. They can look at the structure of language through induction. They can figure out how the language works. But what's important to add to that is to always have it within a context. Absolutely. Okay. Comprehending written text activity. So in other words, reading. Students can read, for example, a short blog and post about a teen's weekend, a blog post about a teen's weekend, and they can answer multiple choice comprehension questions. They can put activities in order. It depends on what's relevant for the particular text, right? But again, we need to be sure to highlight the target structure if we are working with a new structure of vocabulary, of grammar, or a new vocabulary set. And we have to allow students also to hear it out loud. So it's okay if you read the text out loud to your students while they follow along, yeah? Because they need to be exposed to oral and written input. That's very important. Also very important, do not ask students to produce target structure on their own yet if it is brand new. One of the big mistakes that we make as language teachers is that we force our students to produce the language too early. And this is a big cause of anxiety for our students. Our students are mortified a lot when they need to speak because they feel that they're not ready. Yeah. So before we get to the competence of speaking, we need to provide them with plenty of input through the competences of listening and reading. Super important. Even when you send homework, we don't send worksheets to fill in verbs anymore. We don't do that. We do something that's more communicative. Give your students the chance to be exposed to English more. Find a fun text for them to read. Find a video that you think they might be interested in, they can watch, etc. Give them more opportunities to be exposed to the real language, because I'll bet you something, right? I'm sure all of you teachers have students who are better than others, right? Who might already be fluent in English. Have you ever asked those students how they became so fluent in English? Have you asked them? Like your students who can have a conversation with you in English. Have you said, hey, how did you learn English? I bet you that the majority of them will tell you, I watch movies in English, I read in English, I watch series in English, I have cousins in the United States or in Canada, something. But I bet you that those students are not going to tell you, all I did was study the grammar in my textbook. No, because you don't become fluent that way. So if we can give our students the opportunity to be exposed to these competences of listening and reading outside of the classroom with interesting material that they'll like, we're more likely to be successful as far as getting them to communicate in English in the future, okay? Okay, the print on this is a little bit small, but I couldn't really do much else. So this is an excerpt, this is an example of a reading, obviously. This is a fragment of a text. This text was taken from a textbook series from the Ministry of Education here in Ecuador. This is something that I wrote myself. In 2020, the Ministry of Education in Ecuador wrote new textbooks for the public school system in English. So I was in charge of the textbook that was for the last year of high school in Ecuador. It's called Tercero de Bachillerato, which is the last year of high school. Yeah, so these were for 17-year-olds. According to the curriculum, it's B1. Yeah. Okay, so if you read this text, we don't have time to read the whole thing, but I just want to highlight something. If you read this text, you will see that in this text that is in the context of studying abroad, yeah, we have a lot of verbs that are in the gerund and the infinitive. This was one of the grammar focuses of this particular module, the difference in English between the gerund and the infinitive. So we have a whole text here, right? It's short. Yeah, we have a little bit of a culture box here. And then here, notice we have grammar. It doesn't look like the traditional way of teaching grammar. It's just a grammar note. Yeah. So as you can see, the grammar note says, observe the use of the gerund form and the infinitive in the text. Underline the gerund and circle the infinitive. Okay, that's easy. You can do that without knowing English. But, and here's the important part, what do you observe about how these forms are used? Check your answer with your classmates and then with your teacher. So the students have to develop the rule for using the infinitive or the gerund in English. And you can see some examples. Just look at the first sentence. Studying abroad was just a dream, etc. And then there's more in this text. For example, learning in a different environment, living in another country, being far away from home. So the students say, oh, so it's like a subject in English. Yeah, the gerund is used as a subject in English. We use the gerund, not like in Spanish. We use the infinitive. In English, we use the gerund as the subject. So they can process the meaning of the text. They can understand the meaning of the text in context. And then inductively, they can figure out the grammar rule themselves. And they feel empowered by this. So they get excited. Yeah. And then there are some questions after the text that take us a step further. And they deal with the embedded competences, like critical thinking, like creative thinking, like reasoning, those types of things. Yeah, so you can see some of them are comprehension, what does study abroad mean? But then we have other questions that take it further. Do you think you would like to spend a semester or year abroad? Where? Now you connect with the text, right? It's very important for our students to connect on a personal level with the text so they can think about where they would like to study abroad. Yeah. What are the advantages of studying abroad? Critical thinking. Okay. If I study in another country, what are the benefits? I can look at the text and I can think of my own. Yeah. So here we are dealing with some embedded competences as well. Yes. Okay. Yes, I'm reading Santi's comment right now. I usually do have conversations with them before delivering lessons. We talk about favorite food, activities, future plans, etc. Right? That's real life language. That's real. That's real. And that's what we need. Okay, moving right along. Here are the competences then of speaking and writing, where our students produce. So in the case of speaking, we could have a short conversation, for example, between a server and a customer at a restaurant. Give students just minutes, and I emphasize this, just minutes to brainstorm ideas and then have them speak. So they can think of like, okay, a customer and a server in a restaurant. Okay, it'll be like an American fast food restaurant. I'll order a hamburger. You could be the server. You can ask me what I want to drink. Okay, good. We got the ideas. Let's go. And then you have them speak. Because again, if we give them too much time to prepare, speaking becomes completely not spontaneous. And that's not what we want, right? Again, we ask them to include target vocabulary, food or grammar, imperatives, whatever we worked on. And the focus here needs to be on being able to understand the message, not necessarily accuracy, because this is part of a communicative approach. We focus on understanding messages. Maybe we could focus on the accuracy of the target structure that we were teaching, but if they say a preposition wrong or they do the syntax out of order, did we understand the message? If we understood the message, that's the important part, okay? Producing written texts. Write a short blog in the style of the one you read, for example. We can do a follow-up activity and make students write a blog similar to what they read, but including your own personal information. Be sure again to highlight the target structure and encourage students to use it to communicate ideas in their writing, not to fill a quota. What do I mean by a quota? A lot of times we have like students say, okay, you have to use these verbs on this list. Here are 8 verbs, you have to use all of them. Their writing becomes so unnatural because they're forced to use certain verbs that it takes away from the process. So we can remind our students to use the present perfect in their writing, but limiting them to a specific list of specific verbs, and you have to use every one, makes the writing less natural. Yeah. Again, when we evaluate this, we focus on understanding the message when we evaluate. Maybe our students have a spelling mistake, maybe this, but did we understand the message? Did we understand what they wanted to communicate to us? Oh, we did? That's good. That's the most important thing. The rest is secondary, and the rest will improve as they advance in their studies naturally. Just like native speakers of a language. When we're kids, we say a lot of things wrong in our native language. I eat a hamburger, yeah, things like that, or in Spanish too. Se me ha rompido, like this is typical for kids to say. But one day they fix it and they never say it wrong again. The same process or a similar process can happen in second language acquisition. So those things will be fixed during their acquisition process. Okay, here's an example of a writing activity. Again, I took this from the textbooks from the Ecuadorian public school system, which is from 17-year-old, like the last year of high school, where they write a statement of intent. Notice if we're going to work on the competence of writing, we really need to break down the process step by step. We can't tell students, write a paragraph about this. No. We need to break it down for them. Yeah. If you guys want to learn about each one of these competences, by the way, there are also previous webinars on this Facebook page that talk about the skill of listening, the skill of speaking, the skill of writing, and the skill of reading. So I encourage you to watch those webinars from previous months if you miss them, because each one goes in depth for developing each of those skills, which are essentially competences, right? So here we can see a statement of intent. I give them an introduction. I tell them what a statement of intent is, and I say, now it's your turn to build one. Here, answer these short questions first so that they start brainstorming ideas. What would you like to study? What have you been doing that is related to this field? Things like that, because they were working on the present perfect continuous in this module. So they can use have been preparing, have been researching, etc. Yeah. And then I take it where they have to develop it into the actual text itself using this, right? And here I say in the instructions, be sure to use the present perfect continuous to talk about the activities you have been doing. I don't tell them you have to use these verbs. I don't tell them you have to use this many verbs. No, it's not about quantity. It's about using them to communicate. So here we can see a grammar note that talks about the present perfect continuous. But notice that it's just a note. It's not a whole focus on grammar. It's just like parentheses. It's like, by the way, yeah? Then I have them do a peer review where they exchange their paper and they have to comment on aspects like content, organization, et cetera, and then they incorporate the suggestions from their peer to produce a final version to give into the teacher. If, by the way, just as a note, a side note, if you're going to include peer evaluation, you must do it before you turn it into the teacher, not after. Because if the teacher sees it, supposedly the teacher knows more than the students. So it makes sense for them to exchange first with each other to help each other and then give that to the teacher. Okay? Yeah. Okay, just as I mentioned before, the embedded competences like critical thinking, creativity, reasoning, etc., can be easily worked with within the activities to develop the 4 skills or as reflections on these. Okay, you wrote your statement of intent, right? Now, what would you suggest to another student? What tips would you give them for writing a statement of intent, for example? And you can have a class discussion about that. You can share each other's statement of intent and say, what do we have in common in all of our statement of intents? right? Things like that, where they can also work on these embedded competences. My point here is that we need to take this way beyond grammar structures. We're not teaching like that anymore because that is not communication. Yeah, take it beyond so that students actually have to synthesize and think. Okay? Okay, to finish up today, just to mention the testing using competences. I'm sorry, let me answer Eliberto's question. What's the name of the book for third-year students in Ecuador? If you get in contact with me, I can send it to you. Unfortunately, the Ecuadorian system doesn't have all of those books uploaded to the platform of the ministry. And outside of Ecuador, you cannot access that page of the Ministry of Education. So if you are interested in seeing that text, I can send it to you. Later, if you want to provide your email address, I can send you personally the text that I was giving those examples from. Okay, testing using competences, we have to keep in mind something that's called the washback effect. The washback effect is the idea that testing should mirror the types of activities we do in class. If I'm teaching communicatively in my classroom, I cannot test mechanically. I cannot test telling them, choose the correctly conjugated verb. No. We have to test in the same way that we teach, right? And we have to teach in the same way that we test. They have to be parallel processes. So testing can be a reflection of a class activity, spoken or written. I can have an oral test with my students where I can ask them about their experience writing their statement of intent. Okay, so for class, you wrote the statement of intent. How did you feel writing that? Yeah, what did you think, etc. I can use those activities as basis for evaluation. Testing can be done individually or in small groups, depending on your goals. Communication and not fill in the blank or multiple choice should be the core of any evaluation. Can my student communicate messages, and can my student understand messages? That's our question as evaluators, right? And of course, we need to use appropriate rubrics to evaluate the productive skills being speaking and writing. The rubrics that we use do not need to be the same for every activity. It depends on our focus. If you want to learn more about rubrics, you also have a webinar that's specifically about creating rubrics on this Facebook page. And you also have in the webinars about speaking and writing, you have a part in each of those that is about creating rubrics. So if you would like more detail about that, you can consult the webinars that were done previously. My last question for you is, have you ever done any evaluation that you consider to be non-traditional? In other words, not just fill in the blank or multiple choice. Have you, in your classes, ever conducted an evaluation that has been non-traditional? Please share your ideas with us in the chat so that we can also maybe use these ideas in our classes, right? Because sharing is caring, like we say, and if we can share with each other, we all improve. Yeah. Thank you, Eliberto, for your very generous comment. Santi, thank you. Asking students to write opinions about a situation in our city, for example, garbage. That's real life. That's real. That makes language real for them. That's great. Thank you. Exactly. Contextualizing it. Very good. Okay. That's all for today. That's all for this webinar. I really hope this has been helpful for you. I hope you consider it useful and you will be able to take some of these ideas and apply them in your own contexts. I would love to hear about them. If you want to write comments on the Facebook video or whatever, it would be really nice to hear how you apply these ideas in your own classroom. Before I announce the Zoom session, one more thing I want to mention is that in the near future, there will be a survey on this page about the topics you would like to hear more about in these webinars, because we always have ideas, but it's nice to hear from you teachers. So please pay attention to the Facebook page, because in the near future, we will distribute a survey to see what are the topics that you consider to be the most important and most relevant. So please, we'd love to hear your opinions in the future. Otherwise, you can join me in about 10 minutes. I will be on Zoom for the Zoom session. We can continue to discuss these topics and other related topics in about 10 minutes. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again next month. Take care, teachers. Bye.